In this first chapter, we tackle the roots of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Let's start by defining a fact that cannot be denied. One land for two peoples who historically have never had a land. Just to say, the Jews have claimed the land of Israel since 70 AD, following the destruction of the last temple in Jerusalem. From that moment, the famous diaspora began, with the Jews spreading first across Europe and then the rest of the world. And then there are the Palestinians, a population of Arab origin, but not entirely Muslim. In fact, not at all. They settled in the area, beginning with the various migrations that affected the region starting from the 4th century AD. They blended and intermingled with other ethnic groups, but never received a clear imprint, a clear recognition as an autonomous nation. The major conflict occurs in the 1900s, when the two respective national movements, first one and then the other, claim the status of a nation. A nation is not simply a state. A nation is being recognized as a community with its own language, traditions, and history. For example, there is the Armenian nation, which is not exclusively the state of Armenia, but also includes all the immigrants, primarily in France. There is the Italian nation, which existed long before the unification of Italy in 1861. There is a Jewish nation, in this case Israeli, and there is the Palestinian nation. The trouble is that making two such different nations coexist, both of which have long been unrecognized by either side, is problematic. Very, very problematic. It's even challenging for the United Nations. Think about it, the modern United Nations, born from the ashes of the failed League of Nations and following the Atlantic Charter signed during World War II by Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, found themselves facing various issues almost immediately. One of these was the former British mandate over Palestine. After all, from 1919 onward, Great Britain administered much of the Middle East under the Sykes-Picot Agreement, an agreement that we might call underhanded, signed in the midst of World War I, the so-called Great War, between Mr. Sykes and Mr. Picot, representatives of the British and French foreign ministries, respectively. These two gentlemen, acting on behalf of their governments, decided, while the war was still ongoing, to carve up the spoils of what would no longer be the Ottoman Empire. Arabia was officially left to the Hashemites, who lost it a few years later in a civil war with the Wahhabis of Al Saud. The rest of the peninsula was divided, and the Kingdom of Iraq, which had never existed before, was created from scratch and entrusted to a Hashemite. The Kingdom of Transjordan was also created, again entrusted to a Hashemite, but both were puppet regimes, dependent states rather than independent ones. Dependent on whom? Great Britain, of course. Then there was Syria and Lebanon under French mandate, and then there was Palestine. Palestine, which in the 1920s began to experience massive Jewish immigration. Driven by what? There's a word that for some sounds like an insult or a bad word. In any case, Zionism. But do you know what it means? Zionism primarily derives from Mount Zion, one of the hills of Jerusalem, which holds great religious significance according to Jewish tradition. However, the term Zionism refers to the desire to give the Jews a homeland on earth. Those Jews who are scattered, as we mentioned, across the globe. Between the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they began to form a kind of national consciousness. The credit for this goes to a journalist named Theodor Herzl, who was Viennese but Jewish. In 1896, Herzl witnessed an event that shocked him. Some of you may already be familiar with this event. Perhaps you've seen it depicted in the film An Officer and a Spy by Roman Polanski. That event was the degradation of Captain Dreyfus, a French artillery officer falsely accused of high treason with tampered evidence. It was later clarified that Dreyfus was merely a victim of others' manipulations. But that public degradation, accompanied by an anti-Semitic hate campaign, drove Herzl to write a text, the Manifesto of the Zionist Movement. And what was written in that manifesto? The desire to give the Jews scattered around the world a homeland. After all, between the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Jews were not faring well in Europe. In fact, it wasn't just France, where post-1870 defeat revanchism, along with suspicions toward both Jews and Alsatians, Dreyfus had the fatal flaw of being both Jewish and Alsatian, created a toxic atmosphere. No, there were also pogroms in the East, within the Russian Empire, where the Tsarist police fueled popular anger. A rage born from the lack of food, hunger, lack of education, cold, and disease against the Jews. They were accused of being the cause of all evils. The Tsarist police even went so far as to create a famous historical forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a theoretical manifesto of Jewish supremacism, but which is indeed a forgery. It was simply the Tsarist police's attempt to create the perfect casus belli to justify the pogroms and massacres. It was from Tsarist Russia that the first Jews fled, making their way to Palestine, inspired by Herzl's writings and the desire to find a homeland in Palestine. However, it should be noted that a small Jewish community had existed there for centuries, which initially did not look favorably upon this new immigration. But in the early years, everything was fine. What changed was the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in World War I and the disintegration of the Tsarist Empire. The defeat of the Ottomans, as we mentioned, led to the division of the old empire. The disintegration of the Tsarist Empire triggered further flights. It wasn't just the so-called White Russians in Belarus, the Mensheviks, the opponents of the Bolsheviks. No, there were also Jews fleeing, seeking a promised land, a new homeland. And they began to move more and more toward Palestine, toward Jerusalem. After all, among themselves, when Jews celebrate, they say, "Next year in Jerusalem." There's a cultural, religious, and historical root in all of this. The trouble is that the initially uncontrolled influx of a true migration causes repercussions within the British Mandate, as the British themselves are unprepared to receive and reorganize all these people. It also causes repercussions within the Arab community, which, although under British protection, is displeased. Because more people mean less land to live on, and more settlements are seen as an usurpation. This is where the future Arab-Israeli conflict is born. This is where the first fractures begin to appear, fractures that manifest between the late 1920s and early 1930s, with even pogroms occurring in Palestine. The instigator of these pogroms is the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, a religious authority named Amin al-Husseini, who decides to incite the local population against Jewish immigration. Ironically, those who suffer the consequences of these pogroms are not the European immigrants, but the Jews who had been living in Palestine for centuries, the small local community that is massacred from that point onward. The British intervene, placing restrictions on immigration through the so-called White Paper, and even implementing a naval blockade to prevent ships full of hopeful Jews from landing on the shores of Palestine. World War II adds further elements to a tragedy that could be called tragically perfect. The Holocaust, as we know, represents one of the greatest human tragedies. When the war ends and the horrors of the extermination camps are revealed, the world is shocked, and the British themselves abandon the White Paper, once again allowing immigration, though not without incidents along the way. One such case is that of the ship President Warfield, later renamed Exodus, which set sail from Germany with many refugees from the camps, headed for Palestine. The ship's journey is monitored by British warships and is eventually diverted to Cyprus. At a certain point, the people on board stage a hunger strike. They will either disembark in Palestine, or they will all die aboard the ship. The case of the President Warfield causes a scandal. But there's more. After the pogroms of the 1930s, the Jews in Palestine had organized themselves into self-defense groups. There's the Haganah, a true self-defense militia. And then there are the terrorist groups of the Irgun, and, as an offshoot of this, the Stern Gang. These are extremists, ultra-nationalist Jews. For them, the important thing is to conquer all the land, take everything that's necessary. And it is these groups that not only assault Arab villages, but also the British themselves. They attack police stations and checkpoints, even going so far as to blow up an entire wing of the King David Hotel, which housed much of the British Mandate's high command in Palestine. The terrorist attack on the King David Hotel is the final straw that breaks the camel's back. From that moment on, the British hand the mandate back to the United Nations. And what do the United Nations do? They discuss. They discuss until they reach a resolution that officially recommends the partition of the former mandate into two separate states, one for the Jews and one for the Palestinians. The term Palestinian begins to be used to define the Arab community living in the territory. It is a community that is not recognized as Egyptian, not recognized as Syrian, not recognized as Lebanese, and not even recognized as Jordanian. Palestinians, people without a flag, without a nation, without anything to guarantee their legitimate aspirations. Resolution 181, voted on November 29, 1947, recommends this division, some here, some there, with Jerusalem as a free city, an independent entity that would guarantee the rights of all, but would not belong to either of the two states. It's a utopia, a beautiful utopia as theorized by the United Nations General Assembly. But it is not a practical utopia because immediately after the proclamation of the State of Israel, in a wing of the Tel Aviv Museum, where a portrait of Theodor Herzl hangs, the first of the Arab-Israeli wars begins. Israel, which is not yet a fully established state, but is struggling to assert itself as one, is attacked by Egypt, Iraq, the Kingdom of Transjordan, Syria, and Lebanon. Certainly, not all armies participate equally, but notice one thing. The Arab republics and the Arab kingdoms do not intervene to protect the Palestinians. They are not interested in that. What they want is to grab a share of the spoils. They do not want a Jewish state because, in reality, they want to lay their hands on Palestine. And this becomes evident by the end of the 1949 war. Yes, a state of Israel emerges, but everyone has taken something. Egypt, for instance, took the Gaza Strip, which it held until 1967. The Kingdom of Transjordan took the West Bank, which, by the way, is the most fertile area of the Jordan Valley. The territories that were supposed to be given to a Palestinian state, which had no structures, no leaders, nothing, were taken by other states. This is one of the great distortions of the Arab-Palestinian conflict. Think about it. Many proclaim themselves as sponsors and supporters of the Palestinian cause, but few are willing to give up something so that a Palestinian state can truly be born. It is no coincidence that until the mid-1960s, Palestinians were essentially unwanted guests in their own land, administered by other states. They lived in refugee camps in the West Bank, in Transjordan, and in Gaza. This should have been their land. And yet they lived as barely tolerated guests of the Egyptians and Jordanians. Then history would bring many changes in several conflicts, which we will discuss in future episodes. What stands out in all of this is that it took until the Oslo Accords of 1993 for the real foundations of the Palestinian state to be established, to implement that United Nations General Assembly resolution. How many years passed from 1947 to 1993? Do the math, 46 years. It took 46 years to begin to sketch out a division of the land, to finally create a true Palestinian state. While the Israeli state already had solid structures at its birth, with a government, a semblance of a parliament, which later became the Knesset, and state institutions, the Palestinian state had nothing. It had to essentially adopt, absorb, and reorganize what it found, even with some distortions. If we have reached the current situation where there are almost two Palestinian states, the West Bank under the Palestinian National Authority and the Gaza Strip, governed for many years by Hamas, it is because, unfortunately, the Palestinian people have always lacked a true sense of national consciousness. In the Palestinian sphere, the idea was always to reclaim an idealized land without precise boundaries or a clear structure. Reclaiming what had been taken by the Jews was the mantra for a long time among Palestinian militant groups, some of which were responsible for acts of pure terrorism, even in Europe. The Zionist enemy, that word we've already said, has a negative connotation, though it originally had noble intentions. But if Israel, despite all its difficulties, distortions, and contradictions, has nonetheless become a democratic state with Western foundations, the fact that there is no Palestinian counterpart only exacerbates the difficulties. And then, to complicate matters, there are those opposing extremisms, those opposing nationalisms that once again divide what should be united. I'll leave you with one final thought. We are all human beings, we breathe the same air, we drink the same water. John Fitzgerald Kennedy said this many years ago, and he was right. It doesn't matter whether we are Caucasian, African, or Asian, Indian, or Amerindian. No, that doesn't matter. We could be Jews praying to Yahweh, Arabs praying to Jesus Christ, or Muslims. Or maybe we follow one of the many doctrines that arose in the area and are considered heretical by the major revealed religions. We speak Arabic or English, or French, German, Spanish, or perhaps that new Hebrew language that emerged in the 1940s and 1950s. But we are all human beings. What divides us, unfortunately, is a dark force called hypernationalism, a force that drives us toward disaster. Hypernationalism means identifying one's own nation above all others, above the rights of other peoples. It means that we arrogate certain rights to ourselves at the expense of others, or even deny others access to fundamental rights. This is the real evil. If there is Hamas on one side, along with the Al-Aqsa Brigades and Islamic Jihad, On the other side, there are religious extremists who do not accept sharing the land. They do not accept it. The refusal to stop building new settlements, or even to demolish illegal settlements built over the years, is the real problem. What is needed is for both sides to relinquish certain very arrogant, very distrustful attitudes that only lead to conflict.